You know, there comes a time in the life of every Miata, especially these early 1.6 cars that are about 30 years old at this point, when the stock suspension just kind of wears out. When it's time to replace and upgrade, there's always the temptation to go overkill and get coilovers and go full race car with it and slam it to the ground. And yeah, that's not really me. That's not really what I want to do. I want to keep this a nice road car that's still comfortable to drive around town in, and the occasional weekend road trip or twisty canyon road. Still want to have fun with it, of course, but not go over the top and make it really harsh. So enter the Flying Miata Stage 2.5 Koni suspension package. Comes with yellow Koni Sport shocks, which I put on my Opel, and I love them. They're fantastic, and they're adjustable, which is nice. They have their own proprietary lowering springs that they developed, which should just barely lower the car a little bit. To be honest, I think the Miata is already a pretty low car, so I don't think it needs very much. A set of their sway bars that are a little bit bigger and stiffer, and they have extra holes in them for adjustability. And their special rear shock mounts, which allow for more shock travel while still letting you lower the ride height a little bit. So that should keep it comfortable. I also got some new KYB front upper shock mounts. It just seems like a good idea to replace them while we're doing this. I also went for their adjustable end links to set up these sway bars a little bit better than if I just kept the stock ones. Also going to be adding some Racing Beat blocks for the front sway bar to reinforce the stock mounting point because it's pretty weak. We'll be taking a look at that when we get to it, but I am really excited to see how this is going to transform the handling and the comfort of this car. There is a bit of a prerequisite before you dive into a full suspension upgrade, especially on these early 1.6 cars. You should really do a bit of chassis stiffening and reinforcing to really get the full benefit of a new suspension. I've done that on this car, and for some reason I didn't film it, but Mazda themselves, in their wisdom, started adding these braces to the later 1.8 cars. So there's a seatbelt tower brace behind the seats, and underneath the car there's a front and rear underbody brace. So those are easy to bolt on. There's also frame rail reinforcements, which every NA should get. They go over the factory frame rails, which are so weak that you can't even use them to jack up the car or they'll just crush. So really a good thing that helps strengthen the chassis. And once those things are done, I think we'll really feel the full potential of our new suspension. So something to keep in mind. Fast forward, it's a new day, and as you can see, I've got the front of the car raised up. I'm gonna do half of this at a time just because I have a slanted driveway, and of course, as soon as I try to start talking, an airplane flies over, but that's okay. Here's what we're looking at. Here's all the original stuff. It's pretty grungy in here, so I think the first thing I'm gonna do is actually do a bit of cleaning before I take anything apart, just to make it a little nicer to work on. But while we're in here, I'm gonna keep an eye on anything else that needs to be replaced. I've also taken off the front under tray, of course. It's just several 10 millimeters. Pretty easy to figure out. Okay, things are looking a little bit better. Definitely not perfect, but easy to work on for now. So let's take this old sway bar off first. I'm gonna start with the end links on both sides and then finish off with the mounts. Hey, if you don't have power tools, it's okay. Just use a breaker bar or something. But there we go. Out with the old. There we have it. Easy. Okay, here's a quick comparison between the original one and the new one. The old one is about 19 millimeters and the new one is about 22. So a nice little upgrade. Okay, we're just about ready to take the actual coilovers, if you will, out of there. Because these are technically coilovers, they're just not what you think of. So there's this bottom mount down here, and the top mount has these on either side, of course. That's all we have to take out for now, is those two. Now this one is what attaches the shock to the upper mount. We don't have to mess with it yet, we can do that when it's out of the car. Okay, first thing we're gonna do is crack this lower shock mount. Oh yeah, pretty tight. Maybe I'll leave that bolt in there for now, just so it's still held in place. Okay, now we have to slide out this upper control arm bolt, which is massively long, which is good that we took the sway bar out because it has to pass through this cavity here. Goes the upper control. Okay, now we have all the space we're going to need to get this out. There we go. Should be able to just push the whole thing down. Let's see. Yeah, okay, the top is out. Hey, extraction. That happened rapidly. There we go. One extracted original coilover, if you can call it that. I still think you can, because it's a coil over a shock, and it's one self-contained unit, which makes this a pretty easy swap. These shocks have done their job, but you know, they're 30 years old. It's time to retire. Okay, let's go do the exact same thing on the other side. Before we can start bolting on new stuff, we have to prepare the new shocks and springs. So the first step is to install this washer onto the Konis, and then Flying Miata suggests adjusting these rings to the topmost position. I'm using the rear shocks right now as an example, but it's the same on the fronts. Next we can slide on the spring seat. And it doesn't hurt to pre-adjust these. Flying Miata suggests 3/4 of a turn from full soft. Just realize that you have to hold onto the shock shaft while you turn this knob because they're separate from each other. Next you can slide on the bump stops, tapered side down. So these are the new KYB upper shock mounts for the front. We're going to have to drill out the center hole to accept the Koni shocks. The hole needs to be 12 millimeters, but if you don't have any metric drill bits, a 1/2 inch is close enough. We'll come back to these rear springs later because they will require a compressor to install or a friend. But on the front ones, it is doable to push the spring down by hand just enough that you can get the top nut started. I zipped it on a little further just to make sure the threads are engaged fully, but it's still not tight. This is now ready to reinstall in the car. Okay, I think we're ready to put the new stuff in. These are all assembled now, and of course this top cap is just barely on. It's loose enough that I can still rotate it so I can make sure it's in the right slot. I'm going to go ahead and put back on this little plastic gasket that was on the old one. Just cleaned it a little bit. I don't think it's very important, but hey, Mazda put it there, so why not? Pop this back on. And installing this should be pretty easy. It's the reverse of removing the old ones, except we have to be a bit mindful about how we torque things, because there are certain things that need to be torqued with weight on the suspension. So we'll go through that. By the way, these Konis come with this provision on the side of it. I'm not sure what it's for. My car doesn't have a fitting like that. There was nothing on the old shock. Hopefully somebody in the comments can tell me what that's for, but in my case, it doesn't matter which way that's facing. I think I'll face both of them towards the rear of the car. Start with getting the bottom part in, get this past the fender. Be careful not to scrape it on the fender up top. We have to push it down a bit, there we go. Get the bolt started on the bottom. Just get it through this hole. There we go. Don't really have to tighten it just yet. Push this down. There's one. There's the other. Okay. Takes a little bit of tweaking, but got it in. Cool. Now we can put the control arm back on. I will slightly tighten this, but not all the way, because this is one that needs to be torqued with the car on the ground, or at least the suspension under load. All right, we can go ahead and torque these upper mount nuts without any weight on the suspension. That's fine. These are 12 millimeters. And they're only torqued to about 25 foot-pounds. And 25. All right, so the driver's side is loosely installed. I'm leaving the upper control arm loose, as well as the lower shock mount, as well as the upper shock to mount bolt. Basically everything except for those two nuts on the mount itself. I'm gonna go do the same on the other side, and then I'm going to install the sway bar, and then I'm going to support the suspension to simulate it being on the ground so I can finally torque everything. So let's go. Alright, here's the beefy new sway bar and the adjustable end links, as well as the new bushings and brackets and the special grease for polyurethane. I want to save half of that for the rear ones. Also, got these fancy little Racing Beat reinforcing brackets. Probably not necessary for a street car, but they look like flimsy mounts and seems like a good idea when I'm putting a bigger sway bar on. So, let's get them in. The first challenge is just to get it up and over the various lines and hoses. There we go. Aha. Okay, I think now I'll try to get these mounts on. So if I understand correctly, this is basically how these blocks work. They come with these long bolts and washers and flange nuts. You kind of arrange this way on the mount. And then this just kind of sits up against the car itself, and then you have to progressively tighten these, sort of going back and forth until everything is nice and snug and even on both sides of the car. This is the driver's side one. There's a cutaway for some power steering lines. Still need to grease this, and of course this splits open, so I'll just pop this onto the bar first and then figure out all this bracketry and hardware. This guy's all greased up. Go ahead and get that going. Get these two started into these threaded holes here. Next we have to put these flange nuts on with the flange pointed up. I believe this goes this way. This is really hard to show on camera, so here's a crappy iPhone shot of where this block goes. Now let's get the passenger side started. Should be able to get this sitting where it goes. Yeah. Now with the blocks in place, we can gently run these bolts all the way up, making sure the nuts don't get in the way, and then torque them to 15 foot-pounds. Now that that's torqued, you can basically loosen these nuts, if you will, so that the block is touching the car. And the instructions say just get those finger tight for now, and then turn them a certain number of turns so there's the right amount of preload. But first, we'll go to the other side. It's only going to be possible to turn these nuts a little bit at a time, so it's going to be hard to keep track of how much you've turned them. So I suggest marking them with a red Sharpie or something similar so you can watch it as it goes around. I tightened these one turn at a time, going back and forth between the nuts until they were all 2 turns tight. Alright, both sides are in and I got the 2 full turns on all of those. I'm really glad I marked them. There was no way I was going to be able to keep track otherwise, how many turns. Anyways, this is a nice little upgrade. It's probably not necessary for my use for just street driving for the most part, but makes those mounting points a lot more solid, so why not? Okay, the car is now sitting on the front suspension. The weight is being held by these jack stands under the lower control arms. That jack is just barely touching the cross member just for some extra contingency safety. And you can see these jack stands on the side are there, ready to catch it if it falls, but they're not touching. So everything's compressed, so we can go ahead and torque the things that need to be torqued and install the end links. So why adjustable end links? Well, it's probably not necessary in my case, but it does help when you're lowering a car to make sure the sway bar is in a nice level neutral position, and so it's not preloaded when the car is sitting on the ground, meaning it's not being pulled up or down. These are cool because they have reverse thread on one side, so they're double adjustable. So if you spin this collar, it just expands. So you can adjust it with both ends attached. So all we have to do is set the sway bar so it looks nice and level, adjust one accordingly, and then do the other side so it slips in easily. Should be pretty straightforward. These sway bars give you an option of a couple different holes. So the inboard one is stiffer and this one's a little bit more flexible. Flying Miata suggests using the more flexible one on the front, and on the back there's 3 holes and they suggest using the middle one. Should be a good balance, but if you want to stiffen it up in one end or the other, you always have that option. If you go stiffer on the front, you could be inducing more understeer, and if you go stiffer on the back sway bar, you could be getting more oversteer. So depending on what you want, you can dial these in a bit. But I'll be going with these back holes. Okay, I think the goal here is to get this into a nice neutral position. The only real advice I have for setting how high you want this to be is you want it to be as close to level as possible, but with still enough clearance for the upper control arm. You might compare it to the original one and see that it's different, but that's okay because other things have changed. First, you need to loosely adjust both sides so they're even. Then you can torque the end links to the car and to the sway bar and do a final check that both sides are even before locking down the adjustment collars. With the sway bar complete, I could then finish torquing everything else, from the lower shock mounts to the upper control arms, and finally the upper shock mounts. Then I could throw the wheels back on and put the car back on the ground. the car on the ground, it doesn't hurt to check the adjustment of the shocks just in case something changed. Okay, that wraps up the front suspension. It went pretty well, but I shot a lot more footage than I thought, so I think I'm gonna have to split this up into 2 parts. So rear suspension coming up in part 2, and we'll go for our first drive, see how much better it is than the worn out stock stuff. I am excited. If you're excited, take a second out of your life and press some of the buttons like subscribe and like, and maybe even leave a comment if you feel like it. Anyway, see you next time.